Hi, good afternoon. This is Kelly McKenney Golden, and I'm presenting my case study for EDL 851 Supervision and Evaluation when a good teacher turns bad. So category 1, the problem in identification and analysis. What I know Mrs. Wilson is a principal of Crestview Elementary. She's been a principal for about 3 years. Her first year, she was a little more cautious, not really wanting to rock the boat, but she has a positive outlook on things. Crestview Elementary is one of 3 elementary schools in the district and actually has a very good reputation, good attendance, above average test scores, and the parents are really supportive of the school community. Principal Wilson has also observed some changes in a veteran teacher, Mrs. Horton's behavior. This teacher is a teacher who is very well respected amongst staff, her peers, amongst families, but there have been significant changes in her behavior since the spring. And Mrs. Wilson, the principal, is concerned. So what Principal Wilson knows continued. She's aware of some outside factors influencing the change in Mrs. Wilson's behavior. Also, the Crestview Elementary has begun a new pilot reading program. Mrs. Wilson does not agree with this new change in the program and has been unsupportive of the program and unsupportive of colleagues who do support the program. There have also been numerous complaints about Mrs. Horton and her behavior towards students being abusive, yelling at students, putting students down. She's also been accused of arriving late on several occasions and not wanting to hold parent-teacher conferences. Mrs. Horton has reached out to Mrs. Wilson previously to have a conference, but it really hasn't made any change in the behavior. And now at this point, the superintendent and school committee are involved as parents have been writing letters of complaint about Mrs. Horton's behavior and interactions with the children. We also know that there's a parent meeting scheduled that did not go so well. What do I need to know? I need to know about some of the previous attempts to intervene with Mrs. Horton. I know that there was a one-to-one conference between Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton, but I don't really know the details of that conference or how that went. I just know that it was held. I want to know more about specific complaints about Mrs. Horton from the parents. They said that she puts down students, she hasn't done the conferences, and that she is abusive in nature to students, as well as being late on several occasions. But I'd want to know really more about specific complaints, not just overall generalizations, but maybe specific complaints around individual students. I'd also want to know specific complaints about Mrs. Horton from colleagues. I know she's unsupportive of the new reading, the piloted reading program, but I'd really want to know a little bit more about this and how her interactions with colleagues has changed. I also want to know Mrs. Horton's issues with the reading program. That might be a way to join with her to be able to kind of hear her concerns around this new reading program. Identify the problem. I see the problem kind of threefold in a sense. The overall problem is how to support a struggling teacher. If there are outside factors that are impacting the teacher's work, how do we best tackle that? The immediate problem is how to make the situation right between Julie's father, Mr. Stafford, Mrs. Horton, the teacher, and Mrs. Wilson, the principal. And then the continuing problem is really how to support Mrs. Wilson, which you could kind of see as the overall problem. But Mrs. Horton's particular issue could be a special case. Category 2, proposed plan of action. For the immediate problem, how to make the situation right between Julie's father, Mrs. Horton, and the school. As a principal, Mrs. Wilson should speak to Mrs. Horton after giving her some breathing room around the incident that just took place between Julie's father, Mr. Stafford, and the principal and Mrs. Horton. I think it's important to give her a little breathing room, but then to definitely debrief right after. As a principal, Mrs. Wilson should reach out to Julie's father and set up another meeting. And this next meeting, I believe, should be between Mrs. Horton, Mrs. Wilson, and the superintendent. And it should include a detailed agenda of how the meeting will take place. After doing kind of a debrief of what just happened between Mrs. Horton and Julie's father, I would do a follow-up meeting, kind of reviewing the agenda line by line and explaining that, we are going to have another meeting and this is how the meeting's going to go. Hopefully to kind of keep things in check and keep emotions kind of in line so that we can really get the best result of the interactions between the school, the staff, and the parents. So as I said, for my follow-up, also on the immediate problem, my follow-up with Mrs. Horton, I'm speaking, Mrs. Wilson would speak to Mrs. Horton about the previous meeting. Mrs. Wilson, I believe, should give Mrs. Horton a formal written reprimand. I know she has conference with her before. That hasn't made any difference. And to lash out at a parent like that is just unacceptable. So as a principal, even though she knows that Mrs. Horton has some other things going on, I think it's really important to give that formal written reprimand. Again, explain to Mrs. Horton that another meeting is going to take place with the parent, Mrs. Wilson, and the superintendent, and that there'll be an agenda that goes along with the meeting. The meeting itself will open with the parent sharing his concerns, and then there'll be a line-by-line item on how the school and the district is going to deal with the parent's concerns. I think Julie should remain in that classroom so that we can see some progress from Mrs. Horton. Mrs. Horton should really be given a chance to kind of make things right for this student and this family. So I don't think the classroom change is necessarily the answer, but really trying to reassure the parents that moving forward, that this situation is going to be rectified. The continuing problem, and also kind of overall problem, which is how to support Mrs. Horton and a struggling teacher in general. So if we're looking at an outside social emotional issue, this is kind of the way that Mrs. Wilson should take it. I think she should approach Mrs. Horton in a supportive manner. The principal is aware that there's been a divorce, and now that Mrs. Horton is struggling with 2 teenage boys at home herself. I think Mrs. Wilson should inquire if Mrs. Horton has sought outside support, either counseling, or if maybe there's a need for financial counseling as well, considering that her husband is no longer involved and she is raising 2 sons. Perhaps there's a financial strain as well that, the school is unaware of. And if Mrs. Horton really isn't necessarily comfortable with seeking the support directly from Mrs. Wilson, then Mrs. Wilson should also discuss the Employee Assistance Program and connect Mrs. Horton with Human Resources. The Employee Assistance Program gives a variety of resources, but more importantly, counseling resources. So hopefully that Mrs. Horton can get a little of that additional support. The other part that should be discussed is really, does Mrs. Horton need to go on a little bit of a leave? It shouldn't be thought of as a consequence or reprimand in any way, but maybe Mrs. Horton just needs a little extra time to get her personal affairs outside of school on track, maybe to put in place some of those counseling resources, or if there needs to be financial assistance, and that, she could take a possible leave and that the school and the district would support that. Category 3, promoting student success. So staff and parents together to promote student success is really kind of how I feel about it. The staff needs to be supported. So Mrs. Horton needs to be supported along with her colleagues as well. The parents need to be heard. They need to feel that the staff is not only hearing what they're saying, but they're listening to what they're saying. And they're supported by both the administrative bodies and the staff. And students need to feel safe and nurtured. Students need to be welcomed into a safe environment that's predictable, that they know it's expected of them and of others. And they really need to be able to feel comfortable in that. It's really what it comes down to. It's all about the relationships. These relationships need to be built. They need to be relationships of trust and communication. And that's really where you'll see the most student success. Category 4, debriefing the problem. What was I thinking, feeling, and valuing? So thinking-wise, this was a really interesting case study for me because I was thinking about blending my training as both a counselor with my role as an administrator. I definitely felt for Mrs. Horton that she needed probably some outside counseling support. Again, perhaps financial assistance, but also my role as an administrator was to make sure that not only my staff was supported, but that the students and families were supported as well and that they were being heard. So that's why I think it was important for me to not only help and support Mrs. Norton, but that there be some type of reprimand as well. I think it was really important to give a formal written reprimand because Mrs. Wilson did try to address the situation previously, and it just really hadn't done any good. So try to kind of toe the line of both supportive and, giving, but coming from an administrator as well, a role as well, would definitely be tricky. But I think my training would really kind of set me up for success in those interactions. And finally, valuing really the importance of family concerns to ensure student success. I think that's really important. Again, that families feel that they're being heard and they're being listened to, and that there really will be a plan of action. I think it was important to bring in the superintendent on it as well. I feel that the family, Julie's family, would feel that the school was really taking this issue seriously, even if we weren't going to necessarily give in to Julie's classroom being moved, that we were really hearing what they're saying, we were listening to their concerns, and we were really trying to make a change in the movement for something positive. Unresolved issues. What about the other parent complaints? There have been several parent complaints and kind of how to deal with that. What about the staff interactions with Mrs. Horton? What if Mrs. Horton does not improve? So even with the outside supports, and the plan of where to move forward in her classroom, what if she doesn't really improve and move forward? And then if Mrs. Horton does take leave, how will that be supported? What will be kind of the message that's given out to staff as well as students and families? And how will Mrs. Horton be supported to understand that, again, the leave isn't punitive at all. It's really for her to support herself if needed. Category 5, reflecting on the standard. For component 1, promoting academic success. I think I did this by identifying the student and family needs, connecting back to the learning in the classroom, showing successes to scale from classroom interactions. I think it's important at this next meeting between Julie's father, Mr. Stafford, the superintendent, Mrs. Wilson, and Mrs. Horton, that they highlight kind of the strengths of Mrs. Horton in the classroom and really prior strengths that she's had. And that will maybe kind of alleviate some of the concerns that the family might have around Julie remaining in that classroom. I think should continue to encourage parent involvement. I think maybe some of those other parent complaints might go by the wayside if parents can be more involved in the school community. Maybe around parent-teacher conferences, parents being involved with activities around that. And then again, I think increased communication overall is best, hearing and listening to what's coming from students, families, and the staff is really what's going to promote academic success in the classroom. Promoting student well-being. Again, assuring parents and families of the student well-being. I think establishment of parent-teacher conferences with Mrs. Horton, shadowed by Mrs. Wilson, will be really instrumental. And having an agenda prepared for each parent-teacher conference, and also an agenda prepared for that meeting with the superintendent, Mrs. Horton, Mrs. Wilson, and Mr. Stafford will be really important. I think the parent-teacher conference meetings, if they can really focus on the instruction of the student, and kind of the instructional curriculum of the classroom, that'll kind of keep things on task. I'm sure also the parent-teacher conferences, there are only a certain amount of minutes to review with each parent. So having just like a really streamlined agenda will help this and really help Mrs. Horton stay on task and maybe not get so emotional in the interactions. I think Mrs. Wilson should be present for the parent-teacher conferences too, just as an in case emotions do run high, that Mrs. Wilson can kind of step in and reassure everyone. Component 3, enhancing instructional capacity. Again, increase structured and supported communication, valuing others' opinions, valuing Mrs. Horton's opinion, valuing the family's opinions, and valuing Mrs. Horton's colleagues' opinions. Recognizing strengths and weaknesses, saying to Mrs. Horton that Mrs. Wilson realizes that there's a lot outside of school going on, and maybe balancing that home and school work, balancing act is really difficult for her, and really saying that Mrs. Wilson is happy to help. And trying to support Mrs. Horton's interests around instruction. Again, she was a teacher that was a veteran teacher, a teacher that was celebrated in the district community as being a great teacher. So maybe trying to tap into that again. I know that Mrs. Horton doesn't agree with the new pilot reading program, but ask her what she doesn't agree with. And maybe there's some things that Mrs. Horton can bring to the table that can kind of revitalize her instruction in the classroom. So that was my case study for EDL 851. I hope everyone enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed this class. I really enjoyed Dr. Mindy's interactions with us as students and the way she's kind of personalized things for us. And I'm hoping maybe, even though I have a few courses left, that maybe I can take one additional course with Dr. Mindy. Thank you so much and take care.